Of all the Manson family members, Susan Atkins is perhaps the most infamous. Her name is inexorably linked to the brutal crimes of 1969, her chilling courtroom confessions, and her transformation from lost teenager to convicted murderer to self-proclaimed penitent. Yet beneath the headlines and public outrage lies a deeply complex individual, a woman shaped by a childhood of neglect and chaos, whose search for love, stability, and belonging led her into the arms of Charles Manson. Susan grew up yearning for attention and validation, often adopting new personas in an effort to feel loved. When she met Manson in 1967, his promises of acceptance and transcendence seemed to answer her prayers. But as one of his most visible and vocal followers, Atkins became both a participant in and a witness to horror she could never escape. Despite initially claiming responsibility for Sharon Tate's murder, a claim later proven false, Susan's words and actions cemented her as a symbol of the family's depravity. Over the decades, Susan Atkins transformed herself many times over, from a brash, defiant young woman to a born-again Christian and eventually a devout Catholic. Her faith sustained her through 40 years in prison, yet parole boards and the public remained unmoved, viewing her as the embodiment of unredeemable guilt. Even in her final years, as she battled terminal brain cancer, she expressed both hope in divine forgiveness and a recognition of the karmic weight of her actions. Who was Susan Atkins really? A victim of circumstance? A manipulative performer? Or a soul caught between darkness and redemption, constantly reinventing herself in search of salvation? Susan Atkins was 19 when she met Charles Manson at a Haight-Ashbury party in November 1967, drifting toward him as he played guitar and fixed his attention on her. By then, Susan was already exhausted by life. She had grown up amid alcoholism and neglect, was sexually abused by her older brother, and lost her mother to cancer at 14, a rupture that left her angry, unmoored, and acting out. Her late teens were marked by shoplifting arrests, drug use, and unstable relationships with men who offered brief shelter but no safety. She survived on bravado and risk, still aching to be seen. Charles Manson sensed that hunger immediately. He spoke to her pain as if it were wisdom, turned intimacy into initiation, and drew her into a sexual relationship Susan later described as both terrifying and affirming. Within days, he invited her to join him and the other women on the road, promising belonging and protection. She went, convinced she was being rescued. In early 1968, while the group stayed near Topanga Beach, Susan abruptly left with John Hall and returned weeks later, pregnant. She said the father was actually a drifter, though Manson briefly believed the child might be his. Pregnancy intensified her drug use and defiance, prompting an intervention by the other women. Her bond with Manson grew increasingly strained. She sought reassurance and affection while he mocked her need and withheld approval, making her one of the few women he never fully subdued. On October 7th, Susan gave birth prematurely to a son. Manson initially dismissed her labor, then asserted control over the delivery. The infant required hospital care, and Susan's independence soon led Manson to push her out, keep the child, and later summon her back, insisting she did not fear him enough. In late July 1969, Susan joined Mary Bruner and Bobby Beausoleil at the home of family friend Gary Hinman, a musician who had provided refuge to members at critical times, in a shakedown effort to extort money. Susan and Mary were chosen to go because they were friends with Hinman, familiar and non-threatening. After she and Mary confirmed Hinman was alone and signaled Bobby to enter, Susan remained inside the house for nearly 2 days with the others as the situation deteriorated. At Bobby's direction, she held a gun on Hinman, who managed to wrest it away from her. And then she watched Manson arrive and slash Hinman's face brutally with a sword. Susan helped clean the house, wipe fingerprints, and tend to Hinman afterward. Bobby then stabbed Gary, but when the stabbing failed to kill him, Susan took turns with Mary holding a pillow over his face. Bobby wound up stabbing the musician again. Susan left with the others in Hinman's stolen car, later speaking of the murder as something we had done. Less than 2 weeks later, Susan was sent out again. On the night of August 8th, she armed herself with a knife and rode toward Cielo Drive with Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, knowing violence was inevitable. She climbed over the fence first, following Tex's commands, and moved through the house ahead of the others, scouting rooms, encountering the occupants, and reporting back. She assisted in restraining victims and searching for money. When Tex ordered her to kill, however, Susan froze. That hesitation did not stop the violence. Wojtek Frykowski fought back, grabbing her hair, and Susan stabbed him repeatedly in the legs as panic took over. She chased him outside, lost her knife in the process, rearmed herself, and watched Tex finish the attack. Inside the house, Susan remained with Sharon Tate as she begged for her life and that of her unborn child. Tex returned and ordered again to kill. Susan froze a second time. So Tex shoved her aside and stabbed Sharon himself. Sent back alone after everyone was dead to leave a message, Susan knelt beside Tate's body and wrote the word pig on the door before fleeing. There was no pause afterward. The next night, Manson sent the same group out again, this time joining them along with Leslie Van Houten and Steve Grogan. They drove for several hours before arriving at the Los Feliz home of Rosemary and Lino LaBianca. Manson tied the couple up, then sent Tex, Leslie, and Patricia Krenwinkel inside to kill them. He drove off again with Susan, Linda, and Steve Grogan, discarding Rosemary LaBianca's wallet to mislead police and heading toward Venice. Exhausted and disassociated, Susan was present when Manson ordered another killing, one that Linda ultimately sabotaged. Susan survived, but by then, obedience no longer promised belonging, and survival offered no safety. By mid-August 1969, the insulation that had protected the family was gone. The August 16th arrest at Spawn Ranch, followed days later by the murder of ranch hand Donald Shorty Shea, made clear that both violence and exposure were accelerating. When the group fled again to Death Valley, Susan began talking with disarming ease. She admitted involvement in Hinman's killing to several people, including Bobby Beausoleil's girlfriend Kitty Ludesinger. When Kitty implicated Susan in the Hinman murders to investigators, she was transported to Sybil Brand, the main women's jail in Los Angeles County, where she sang, performed, and confessed to fellow inmates, most notably Virginia Graham and Ronnie Howard, offering graphic accounts of the Tate murders that included details only a participant could know, and a few that Susan made up entirely. But those conversations cracked the case open. By mid-November, investigators understood Susan was central. When confronted, she demonstrated intimate knowledge of the crime scenes, the rope over the beam, the order of attacks, the placement of bodies. Prosecutors offered her a chance to avoid the death penalty in exchange for cooperation. Terrified of execution, she agreed. On December 5th, 1969, Susan testified before the grand jury, waiving her right against self-incrimination and describing life inside the family and the murders in harrowing detail. At least one juror became physically ill listening to her testimony. 3 days later, Indictments were returned against Manson and his core followers, including Susan herself. Almost immediately, her cooperation was poisoned. Without her knowledge, her attorney sold her story through Lawrence Schiller, a newsbroker, and portions appeared in the Los Angeles Times, turning Susan into a public spectacle. Returned to Sybil Brand in protective custody, she was pressured relentlessly by visiting family women and reminded that her infant son remained vulnerable. The breaking point came on March 5, 1970, after a jailhouse meeting with Manson. Within days, Susan fired her attorney, cut off cooperation, and formally recanted her grand jury testimony. The immunity deal evaporated. At trial, she followed Manson's lead, misbehaving on cue, replacing competent counsel, and performing loyalty. On January 25, 1971, after more than 40 hours of deliberation, Susan Atkins and her co-defendants were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Her brief turn as the prosecution's key witness ending in submission to the man who had already cost her everything, including her child. Sentenced to the California Institute for Women in Corona, California, alongside Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten, Susan entered prison as both notorious and vulnerable. Because of the publicity surrounding the case, prison officials initially kept the women under heavy guard to protect them from other inmates. At the time, no death row for female prisoners existed in California, so a special unit had been built for them at Frontera. Even among her co-defendants, Susan remained isolated. Her earlier cooperation with prosecutors had fractured whatever loyalty remained between them, and trust was never fully restored. On February 18, 1972, the California Supreme Court ruled the death penalty unconstitutional, commuting the sentences of the Manson defendants to life in prison. The ruling spared Susan's life, but did not offer freedom. Instead, it marked the beginning of decades spent navigating prison life, parole hearings, and the unending public memory of her crimes. Susan was briefly reunited with former family members Catherine Gypsy Scher and Mary Bruner after their convictions related to the Hawthorne shootout of the year before. For a short time, she found herself again among familiar faces, but the reunion was uneasy. Scher and Bruner remained committed to the criminal worldview that had defined the family, and had not yet abandoned the identity Susan herself was beginning to question. Within a year, the other two were transferred to general population, and Susan's brief reconnection with the past ended. By 1973, both Susan and Leslie Van Houten publicly disavowed Charles Manson. The break was significant. Susan had been one of the earliest and most fervent believers, and her rejection of him marked a shift that would define the remainder of her life. Physically, however, she struggled. Years of drug use and untreated illness caught up with her, and by 1974 she was frequently in the prison infirmary. Medical authorities even recommended a hysterectomy due to repeated infections. In October 1975, Susan, Leslie, and Pat were transferred from the Special Security Wing at Frontera to the Psychiatric Treatment Unit at the California Institute for Women. The move allowed a less restrictive environment and access to education and therapy programs. That same year, Susan experienced a religious conversion and became a born-again Christian, publicly denouncing Manson and her past life with the family. She later wrote that revisiting her crimes during parole hearings remained the most painful experience of her life, something she was forced to relive repeatedly for decades. Susan's conversion became central to her identity. She co-authored Child of Satan, Child of God in 1977, and later wrote another book, The Myth of Helter Skelter, framing her story as one of redemption and comprehension. Prison counselors documented consistent behavioral improvement over the decades, cooperation with staff, participation in group therapy, volunteer work, and a marked decline in disciplinary incidents. She pursued her education, engaged in religious studies, and was described by some staff as compassionate toward other inmates. Yet the question lingered: who was the real Susan Atkins? The impulsive young woman who drifted through drugs and violence? The jailhouse braggart who claimed to have killed Sharon Tate? Or the repentant inmate seeking spiritual salvation? The answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is that she was all of these things. Susan had spent much of her life adapting herself to whatever environment she occupied. As the child of alcoholics, she learned early to seek approval and avoid abandonment, often confusing attention with love. With Manson, she became the devoted follower. In jail, she became the shocking storyteller, exaggerating brutality to appear strong. In prison, she reshaped herself again, this time around religion and redemption. Whether conscious or not, Susan was a shapeshifter, someone who survived by becoming what the moment required. It is also important to recognize what Susan did and did not do. She participated in violence, in homicide, and her involvement in the Hinman and Cielo Drive deaths was undeniable. She stabbed Wojtek Frykowski during the struggle at Cielo Drive, yet she did not deliver the fatal wounds to Frykowski or to Sharon Tate, despite claims that she made while in jail. Those claims, repeated endlessly in the press, became part of the mythology surrounding her, even after they were contradicted by evidence and testimony. Why she could participate in violence but freeze when ordered to kill remains one of the most difficult questions in her story. Susan could perform the role of the dangerous thrill-kill cult follower, but when confronted with the final act itself, something in her stopped. That hesitation did not absolve her. Others carried out the killings, but it complicates the portrait often painted of her as purely monstrous. In prison, that complexity continued. Susan's devotion to Christianity was as intense as her earlier devotion to Manson. Many incarcerated individuals turn to religion as a path toward reinvention, and often the conversion is sincere. For Susan, faith appeared to offer a structure capable of containing the shame and chaos of her past. Yet redemption in the spiritual sense did not erase public memory or legal culpability. Her first marriage, to con man Donald Lazier in 1978, ended in annulment within months. In 1987, she married James Whitehouse, a law student who later represented her in legal proceedings. She gradually rebuilt relationships with her family, reconciling with her father before his death, and relatives occasionally spoke on her behalf at parole hearings. One absence, however, remained permanent. After her conviction, Susan's parental rights were severed, and she never saw her son again. It is believed that he was adopted and raised far from the notoriety of his mother's crimes. For Susan, the loss of her child became one of the defining griefs of her life. Years later, Leslie Van Houten apologized to Susan after admitting that she had believed Manson's claim that Susan simply didn't want the baby, a lie that had shaped their relationship for decades. Susan continued to seek parole, though success was unlikely. For victims' families, the hearings reopened wounds that never fully healed. Jay Sebring's nephew, Anthony DeMaria, later described the process as a repeated return to trauma, arguing that the scale and brutality of the crimes justified lifelong imprisonment regardless of rehabilitation. Life inside prison settled into routine. In 1982, Susan was disciplined for operating an unauthorized manicure business. Over time, health problems mounted. She suffered chronic physical issues, was eventually deemed medically disabled in 1999, and required assistive devices for hearing and vision. In 2008, Susan suffered a seizure while exercising and was diagnosed with brain cancer. She was transferred to the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, where her health rapidly declined. A leg amputation followed, and she became bedridden. In 2009, her husband petitioned the state for compassionate release, arguing that her medical condition rendered her no threat to society. Former prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi surprisingly supported the request, believing continued incarceration served little practical purpose and only cost the state more in medical funding. Deborah Tate, sister of Sharon, however, opposed release, expressing compassion for Susan's suffering while maintaining that the severity of the crimes warranted lifelong imprisonment. The court denied the petition. Susan Denise Atkins died in prison on September 24, 2009. Her life remains difficult to categorize. She was neither the caricature of evil often presented in headlines, nor the redeemed figure she sometimes portrayed herself to be. She was a damaged young woman who committed terrible acts, spent decades attempting to reconcile them, and never escaped their consequences. In the end, Susan lived the rest of her life in the shadow of choices made over 3 days in the summer of '69. Choices that cost others their lives, cost her the chance to raise her child, and defined her story long after the chaos of the Manson family had faded into history. Susan Atkins lived many lives, each shaped by her relentless desire to escape her pain and find meaning. From a troubled childhood to the horrors of the Manson family, to her years of remorse and religious devotion, Atkins' story is a testament to the enduring complexity of human nature. Her ability to adapt and reinvent herself may have been her greatest strength, but it also exposed the deep fractures within her psyche. A chameleon, desperate for love and acceptance, yet unable to break free from the consequences of her actions. In the end, Susan faced a fate of her own making. Her karma followed her relentlessly, not as punishment, but as the natural outcome of her choices. Her decades in prison, her estrangement from the outside world, and her painful final days all stand as reminders that while transformation is possible, it cannot erase the past. Susan Atkins' story asks us to grapple with the tension between redemption and accountability. Can someone who has caused such harm ever truly atone? And what does it mean to seek forgiveness when the world refuses to forget? For Atkins, the answer may lie in her final unshakable belief that she was ultimately embraced by a God who could see the truth of her heart, even when no one else could. Charles Manson is a name that conjures fear, fascination, and endless debate. In the decades since the crimes of 1969, Manson has become more than just a man. He is a symbol, a myth, and a mirror reflecting society's darkest impulses. Was he a criminal mastermind who orchestrated unspeakable murders, or a scapegoat for a nation looking to explain its descent into chaos? To some, Manson is a demonic figure, a sociopath who manipulated and destroyed young lives. To others, he's a misunderstood misfit, a folk hero, railing against a corrupt system. In the final video of this series, we ask the question, was Charles Manson a broken man, lashing out at the world that rejected him? Or was he the embodiment of evil, channeling his pain into the destruction of others? Was he a trickster, a cult leader, a mastermind of murder, a wounded child, the most famous inmate in America? All of the above, or something else entirely?